My name is Heseltine, and I'm the founder and editor of UFO Truth magazine. I'm based in the UK. I'm also the vice president of the International Coalition for Extraterrestrial Research. I'm honoured and delighted to be taking part in this virtual conference for SUFOEX, and here is my presentation based on 5 years of research or reinvestigation of the Rendlesham Forest case, which resulted in this book, Non-Human, the Rendlesham Forest UFO Incident, 42 Years of Denial. So here we go with my hour-long presentation, and I hope you enjoy it. The Rendlesham Forest case is arguably the most important UFO case in history. That's a big thing to say because people mostly refer to Roswell being the preeminent seminal case about this subject. However, in many ways, and evidentially, the Rendlesham Forest case is much more involved in the sense that there's a lot more people involved. There are, according to my research, 17 different timed events over approximate 1 week period in late December 1980. So I think whereas we normally think of UFO sightings as a one-off event or one-off evening, one-day event, this is different because there are multiple incursions in and around Rendlesham Forest and the twin bases of RAF Woodbridge and RAF Bentwaters, which is approximately 80 miles northeast of London, if you want to look on a map. So let's get going and see where we go. This is an aerial image of the forest. It's not all of the forest, and it isn't, in fact, it doesn't look like the forest did in 1980 when the incident occurred. The reason for that is in 1987, there was a huge storm which wiped out about 90% of the original trees in Rendlesham Forest. As you can see on this presentation, on the left, you can see the runway of RAF Woodbridge, which at the time was leased to the US Air Force. And if we were to take just go straight up about 3 miles, we'd come across the runway and facility of RAF Bentwaters, the twin US bases that formed the strategic strike capability against any Soviet aggression. Remember, this is pre the collapse of the Soviet Union, so we're talking the Cold War period in December 1980. Now, this little map is interesting for a number of reasons. Many of the incidents take place in this, relatively speaking, small area. And if you can see through the laser that I'm pointing, this field in particular plays a very important role in what we know of the events that took place at Rendlesham Forest. That field, which I'm highlighting with the laser pen, is referred to as the farmer's field. And you'll hear it in lots of talk about the case, the farmer's field. That's what we're referring to there. Okay, so let's get going. Whilst the incident had attracted some media, regional small media coverage before October 1983, it was really not well known. And it was only after the release of this big, what was called a 2-page spread in a very famous newspaper at the time called News of the World, that this incident really took off as a very famous case. So this is when, in a sense, in 1983, October the 2nd, 1983, suddenly there's this big article, UFO lands in Suffolk, and that's official. And as you can see on the lower right-hand side of the screen, there was a section of what was to become known as the Halt memorandum. And this was a 1-page document written by the then Deputy Base Commander Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt. And we'll talk about that further on. But this is a seminal date because it wasn't until 2nd of October 1983 that this case, in a sense, went viral, given the connotations of the time without social media. This is when the case hit the international headlines and said, we've got an important case in the UK. Now, my involvement begins actually in 2007, but I'll come back to that. But in terms of the way the book was written, the book comes about because I was asked to be the lead researcher on a new documentary called Cable Green, which was about the Rendlesham Forest Incident. And I'd never been asked to be the lead researcher on a documentary, so I thought that if I am going to put my name to it, then it has to be accurate. So that led me to go on what would be a 5-year reinvestigation of the case. Now, what I haven't mentioned, and for those of you who are not aware of my background, for 6 years I served in the Royal Air Force Police, followed by 24 years in the British Transport Police. So basically, I had a collective 30-year period of policing environment. And for the last 19 years of my police service, I served as a detective constable, not a high rank, but one which is the backbone of any major investigation. I liked interviewing people, and that became my speciality. And therefore, I became an advanced interviewer of suspects and witnesses. So in a sense, when I came to investigate or reinvestigate the case for what was then the documentary, I applied my police training, my detective training, in examining the evidence wherever I could find it. And so what you have, and it's listed in the book, is that you have a scenario where what was known about the Rendlesham Forest Incident, RFI, short description, prior to 2017, i.e. before I got involved in this reinvestigation. And what was basically known is that there'd been at least 3 nights of UFO activity, that it was largely involving US security police officers, not entirely, but the vast majority were security police officers. There was some physical evidence in the sense of there had been 3 plaster casts taken, actually 2 sets of plaster casts. Physical evidence in the form of an audio tape that we'll come on to, documentary evidence. What I mean by documentary evidence in legal jargon is anything written, which refers to Lieutenant Colonel Halt's memorandum, which we'll come on to, and oral testimony regarding radar, which did not come did not become public until the early 2000s, with the release of UFOs and Nukes, an excellent book by Robert Hastings, that documented interviews with 2 radar military personnel, former radar personnel, who on the night, or at least on one of the nights, confirmed and corroborated that they'd both seen radar tracks, and one of them had actually seen a craft near to the air traffic control tower on one of the nights in question. So that was basically what we knew, but that had taken place over, or accumulated over, a period of 37 years. So 37 years before I get involved in this reinvestigation. As you can see on the screen, you're looking at a photograph of one of the indentation plaster casts. What I mean by that, and we'll come on to it, is that if you look to the photograph on the lower right, you will see a policeman, British policeman, stood by several sticks that are in the ground. The sticks aren't the indentations, but they denote where indentations on the ground were found. And they were found in a perfectly equilateral triangle, approximately 3 meters by 3 meters in dimensions. And so you've got that, these physical depressions, something weighted and pressed down into the soil. And what you see there in the photograph of the plasticast is the upturned depression. So if you can imagine that turned up the other way with the flat side showing, that would be the size and circumference of the indentation. And what you have there is the shape of the depression. So kind of something that pushed down and created this approximately 2 to 3 inch depression. All the plasticasts were of the same size of indentation and circumference. So that's what we mean by the evidence that was available that accumulated over 37 years prior to my reinvestigation. You can also see that there is a drawing in the upper part of the screen showing various views of what was described, seen on the ground by one of the military witnesses, a man called Sergeant Jim Penniston. And Jim Penniston made some drawings that didn't emerge until later, but this is what they showed. It showed a top view looking down as if you were looking from the air down on it, and then it showed a side view, 3D view of the craft. So it was approximately 3 meters by 3 meters. It was black glass-like in appearance. So it had some internal lights just moving around inside. There were no windows, no rivets, no markings of any kind, except for some raised etchings that we'll come to later in the presentation. But that's basically what this craft, if you think of the size and dimensions of the policeman in relation, this is where the craft would have sat on the ground, where these 3 indentations were found. Now, I said I would come back to the Halt memorandum, and now what you need to know is that for about 7 years, I went on to have a collaboration period with this man in the upper photograph, and also center of the 3 people in the lower photograph, which is retired Colonel Charles Halt. Now, at the time, he was the deputy base commander, and he was a lieutenant colonel. Well, I had this collaboration period between 2007 and 2014, working on to develop what I thought would be a viable film script. One of my passions in life is the cinema, and I always thought that the incredible events at Rendlesham will ultimately be turned into a movie at some point. So I'd asked him when I met him in 2007 for a TV documentary if he would work with me to develop that script, and he agreed, which was great. And that period of collaboration continued for 7 years. It did end in late 2014, perhaps early 2015, because he began to say some things that I didn't think were accurate, professional, and he didn't produce the evidence to back up the things that he was saying about one of the witnesses in particular, which we'll come on to. So by 2017, prior to my reinvestigation, I'd obviously met Colonel Charles Halt, had a good rapport with him initially. I had met with John Burroughs, I'd met with the original military whistleblower of the case, Larry Warren, and I'd also met Sergeant Jim Penniston. And for those of you who are well familiar with UFOs, you will no doubt recognize the person Nick Pope, who is a very prominent in most TV documentaries as the go-to man on this on the UFO subject. So that's where we are now. Let's now look to the right-hand side of the screen, and what we have is this very famous document, arguably one of the most famous documents in UFO history. And yet it's only one page. So why is it so famous? Well, I think the real answer to that is it was written on Department of US Air Force notepaper, as you can see at the top of the screen. And it was just 3 paragraphs. It was written as a one-page memo to the Royal Air Force. Now, this incident had occurred on outside land between the twin bases of Arrow Woodbridge, Bentwaters. And so, because it had happened on English land, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt was told basically to write a memo and alert the Royal Air Force that an incident had taken place. He titled it Unexplained Lights. It was dated the 13th of January 1981, so approximately 2 weeks after the events had taken place. This was caused because the person who was going to receive this, Squadron Leader Morland of the Royal Air Force, was on a holiday at the time, and Halt waited until he got back to the base. He was the liaison officer between the Royal Air Force and the US Air Force, so naturally it would go to him. So why is this document so famous? Well, for a number of reasons. Let's look at the first paragraph. We're talking about a dated incident. It's actually dated the 27th of December. And it basically says that 2 US security police officers had gone out into the forest to follow some strange lights, and eventually at least one of them had got very close to what was described as a triangular object, 3 meters by 3 meters, what I discussed earlier. The second paragraph of his interest, because it describes the indentations in the ground, i.e. 1.5 inches deep and approximately 7 inches in diameter. And what it then goes on to say is that 2 nights later, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt, the then Deputy Base Commander, the man in the top of the screen and in the middle of the photograph on the lower of the screen, he had led a team out into the forest after being told that a UFO had been seen in the forest again. Now, he went out with a small team, and basically he went on to say that he too saw multiple UFOs whilst out in the forest. So what makes it really important as a historical document for me is the fact that he signed that document, which you can see at the bottom of it, but he, having been the deputy base commander of what was a nuclear base, the top strike base against Soviet aggression in the UK, so he put his name to say he saw multiple UFOs whilst he was out in the forest 2 nights after that initial landing of the small triangular craft. And that's why it's become so famous, because in many UFO accounts, you just have oral testimony, but you don't have military documents. And you'd certainly very rarely have anybody of the rank of Lieutenant Colonel, very high rank, and his actual base role was Deputy Base Commander, someone of that importance putting their name to seeing UFOs. So that's why that was particularly important. Now, this is a beautiful aerial shot of, if you remember on the first slide that I showed you an aerial view and drew your attention to what was just a relatively small area, a farmer's field. At the time, it was just a ploughed field with grass, and there were cows that would occasionally roam on the field and just mill about on the field. This is now how it looks. However, we can still use it. Now, if you look to the left-hand screen, you'll see a red arrow that points towards the direction of the sea, and there was a lighthouse on the very edge of the sea called the Orford Ness Lighthouse. And that shows you the direction in the photograph to that Orford Ness Lighthouse. The lighthouse has come to play a very prominent role in the case, wrongly, in my opinion, but we'll go on to talk about that. But I want to draw your attention now to various things, point things out in this photograph. The first is the red oval object, circle, on the right-hand side of the screen, and it says Halt's first night landing site. Well, remember, the forest is not quite as it was now, as it was then, because of the storm, but new trees were planted, and this is how it pretty much looks now. So in that general area, Colonel Halt would say that that is where he was taken, where the first night landing depressions of that triangular object was seen on the ground. Then you'll see moving second in, the second red oval, it says LW landing site. That means Airman Larry Warren landing site. Now, this is a very controversial account given by the then original whistleblower of the case, Airman Larry Warren, who was just 19 years old at the time when he got involved in this crazy incident. And then if we go to the photograph, that's again a picture of now retired Lieutenant Colonel Halt, Charles Halt. And at the time photograph was taken, I think in 2010 by myself. He also pointed out an area, if you go to the left of that photograph, where it says Halt beam at feet. Now, this is an incident that Halt went on to describe when this case went public in 1983, after he'd retired from the Air Force, I think 1991. He was then able to take part in TV documentaries. And this is him pointing to the where it says Halt beam at feet to its left. And he said that a UFO had approached at high speed, stopped above the group that he was with, and then shone what was akin to a laser beam down at his feet. Now, until I reinvestigated this case, nobody had actually been able to identify where that took place in the geographical landscape. And this is where it is. So where he is pointing to is that field, and where the red oval on the left-hand side of the screen is where the beam came down. You can see the sea in the background, so we're perhaps talking 4 or 5 miles maximum from the sea to the area of what is regarded as the farmer's field. I also want to point out that if you look to the left, you will see a house. That's one of the houses that edges onto this farmer's field. But what can't be seen, because the photograph of Halt is in the way, is that there is another house behind the trees, literally to the left-hand side of the photograph, which is known as the farmer's house, which plays a part in this story. So there you go. It's a great aerial picture to show you where some, and I mean only some, of the incidents took place. But these are 3 prominent incidents. So I've mentioned his name. What does he look like? Who was the original military whistleblower? Well, the guy was called Larry Warren, just 19 at the time. This is him. And he served in the US Air Force for approximately 1 year. This was his first overseas tour, and his only overseas tour, because he only did less than a year in the Air Force. But at the time, he was posted to RAF Bentwaters and Woodbridge, and here we are with him in uniform. So he's 19 years old then. This is 1983. Now, I said that I began a reinvestigation in 2017 for this documentary. Now, because I'd been interested in the case for many years, I'd met Colonel Halt in 2007 for a TV documentary. I had done some private research up until then. I thought I knew the case very well in terms of general knowledge, but I thought I'll do a reinvestigation because I want to be accurate if I'm going to put my name to it. So basically, that's what I did. And I approached some people who were still alive, some researchers, one of whom was the person on the left of this photograph, and his name was Ray Boucher. And in the photograph, he's with his colleague, Scott Colburn, who sadly passed away in the last couple of years. But they did some very important research on the Rendlesham Forest case in approximately 1984 to 1986. Now, they were both American. They both lived in the state of Nebraska in the United States. And they became involved because they belonged to MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, the largest UFO research association group in the world, I believe. And they did some important work. They went over and spoke to a lot of people. They did very early interviews. And it was when I came across Ray Boucher that I decided to contact him. Social media was then available, and I found him on Facebook. We hooked up and we agreed to have a Skype session, which I recorded. And I remember talking to him. We got on really well, and I remember saying to him, "I don't suppose you've still got all your research notes for all your inquiries on Rendlesham Forest?" And to my surprise and delight, he said, "Yes, I do." Now, initially, I was a bit skeptical. I have to confess, I was a bit skeptical because not that many people are that well organized to have kept something back that, was many, many years earlier, some 31 years earlier, or I think at the time I was contacted. But he said, "I'll have a look for it, and if I find it, I'll send it to you. I'll scan it, and then I'll send it to you." And I came away from the conversation, having enjoyed it, thinking, well, it'd be great if he has it, but let's see. Well, unexpectedly, about 2 weeks later, I then get an email and an attachment saying, "Here is all of my research. I've scanned it, and do whatever you want to do with it." And so I thanked him, and I remember being so excited to get this document. And you might expect 50, 100 pages. There were 345 pages in a PDF document. And I just was, wow, I have to read this. I'm really excited. And I remember staying up literally all night until I'd finished reading the entire 345 pages. And suffice to say that I was absolutely amazed at some of the things that I found, not all of which are in this presentation because there simply isn't time. The real presentation of Rendlesham would take probably 3 to 4 hours with everything that I know and important things that emerged through the reinvestigation. But this is an hour's presentation, so some things I've had to put down. But suffice to say, we will come back to some of those things. Now, one of the documents that I came across was a scan of what was a transcript and of a famous documentary made by CNN, Cable News Network, that was recorded in 1984 and I think released over 3 successive nights as like a CNN special presentation in, I believe, early 1985. Now, obviously, in 1985, we didn't have great CGI graphics and fast-running computers good with graphic capabilities. So we basically had drawings that accompanied the testimony and the presentation given by the lead investigator of that documentary, who was a guy called Chuck Picaro. So what else was the existing narrative of the case prior to my investigation? Well, early narrative, civilian researchers, and the emergence of Larry Warren's Capel Green scenario. But what does that mean is, if you look in the middle photograph, or the photograph in the middle of the screen, you'll see 2 women, one of which is a famous British UFO researcher called Jen Randall. And then beside her is a lady called Dot Street. and she was the earliest research with another lady called Brenda Butler, and they were two housewives who basically became aware, because they were part of the UFO group, and they became aware of stories emanating from the base that something happened within days of the incident taking place. So the lady in the middle, who I actually gave an award to through my magazine, UFO Truth magazine, recognizing her involvement in the case. She was the earliest researcher, along with Brenda Butler, who began civilian investigations. So great credit to them. And the guy on the right, the much taller man in this photograph, is Ray Boucher, the man who'd done this great bit of research and who'd sent me this document comprised of 345 pages. The other picture, again, is a photograph of Nick Pope, who kind of went public with his UFO background of being working for the British government and had worked for the Ministry of Defence in what was referred to as the UFO desk, which I'll come on to. But suffice to say, he's important to the case for a number of reasons, which we'll go into later. But suffice to say, in 1996, Nick Pope becomes heavily involved in the Rendlesham Forest incident when he talks about it in his first book, Open Skies, Closed Minds. Open Skies, Closed Minds. Okay, so let's move on. Now, the existing narrative centered on three people in particular. Well, four people. The original military whistleblower, Larry Warren. He became the original military whistleblower because he was the first person to go public using his real name, Larry Warren. Originally, it had been under a pseudonym that had been given to him by other researchers. But when he went public, really in late 1982, and certainly had become very public by late 1983 with the release of that big newspaper story in the News of the World, he was the first person that said, "Hi, my name's Larry Warren, and I was there, and I saw something strange." Now, the narrative, he was on his own speaking about this under his real name for about 8 years after the case became internationally known. So we're looking at 1983, it becomes world famous, and he is alone for about 8 years until about 1991. And so he is interviewed many, many times, becomes very well known and associated with the case because he's the only one who was going public and being interviewed under his real name, hence why he's the military whistleblower. However, in the early 90s, a number of things happened. You had three genuine witnesses, Colonel Halt, Jim Penniston, who was the man who got closest to the landed triangular craft on the first night, and he was accompanied by an airman called, at the time, an airman called John Burroughs. So you had three people who quickly retired. I think Halt in 1991, Jim Penniston in 1993, and John Burroughs, I think, in 95, maybe 1998, offhand. But they retired. And as soon as they retired, a strange thing really kind of happened. If you look back at it and look at it objectively, all these three people, once they retired, then began to attack verbally the original military whistleblower, the man in the bottom of the screen, Larry Warren, and basically saying, well, we have no recollection of this, and basically it doesn't match any of our recollections. Now, there are a variety of reasons for that, which are too complex to go into here. Suffice to say that the narrative, the overall story, and the way it was portrayed in the media and in documentaries of which some 50 or 60 documentaries have been made in English around the world, and there've been many foreign documentaries as well. But the English-speaking ones, they basically attacked and called into question the account given by Larry Warren. And the question is why? Now, again, prior to my reinvestigation, was there any evidence to say that Larry Warren's Cape Green scenario was genuine? Well, let me first of all give you the scenario that Larry Warren, the guy at the bottom of this screen on the previous slide, well, what he said was that in 1983, when it went public in 1983, is that in late December 1980, he'd not been on the base long, just arrived there. Within a few days, he is then posted onto shift, one of 4 shifts that operated for the US Air Force Security Police. And on one of those nights, he was basically taken into the forest. He thought initially that it was some kind of exercise, but he was taken into the forest with a number of other security police, and eventually, with others, goes through the forest on foot and reaches the edge of that farmer's field that I mentioned in that aerial photograph. We saw that lovely aerial photograph where I pointed out a number of things. And he said that when he entered the field, it was illuminated, even though there were no lights there, but it was illuminated by what he said was a strange circular piece or area of what he described as yellow mist or green, almost like a fog, but the fog was in a circular pattern. It kind of glowed, and it was maybe no more than 1 to 2 feet, 30 to 60 centimeters in height. And it seemed to glow, and it just was very weird. And what he saw was a number of security police officers positioned in a cordon all around it. And he was then encouraged to go into the field and join that cordon. Now, as he got to the cordon, he was then told, and he heard over the radio, it's coming, there's a red light coming. And then he saw a strange beach ball sized red colored object come over from the direction of the sea, approximately 5 miles away. And then it stops over this yellow mist. And then suddenly there's an explosion of light. Everybody has to rub their eyes. And when they refocus, where the mist had been, there was then a translucent, shimmering, delta-shaped UFO where the mist had been. He then went on to say that senior officers had turned up, including the base commander, a man called Colonel Gordon Williams, responsible for 12,000 personnel. He then goes on to say that off the fabric of the craft, there appeared to be like a bubble that came out, and then the bubble divided into 3, and within each of the 3 bubbles, he saw the upper torso of what we would describe now as greys, alien greys, small creatures with large heads and big eyes. And there then was some kind of silent, appeared to be some kind of silent communication going on as the base commander, Colonel Gordon Williams, and these 3 beings hovered beside the craft, and they're maybe 10 feet apart. Eventually, he gets told to leave the field, so he leaves the field and then he goes back to the base. But suffice to say that he also said that there were cameras filming this incident. And we're talking about moving film, video. Now, in 1980, there were early video cameras. So he saw one of those, big shoulder one. And then he said that there was a cinefilm camera on a tripod. So we'll talk about the film later on that allegedly was taken. So that was his story. And obviously, that is an incredible story. It sounds like science fiction, but that's what he said. Now, the question is, was there anybody to corroborate what Warren had said when it came to my reinvestigation? So this very science fiction type, deemed controversial case account was criticised by the likes of Halt, Penniston and Burrow. So when I began my investigation, I was looking for anybody to prove that Larry Warren's Cape Green scenario was genuine. And I found initially two people that would indicate that something along those lines. If we look to the lower photograph, lower right, there is a photograph of a guy called Greg Battram, who was a friend of Larry Warren's. And he said that when he was interviewed by Ray Boucher and by a civilian detective called Larry Fawcett in 1984, he said that he thought he saw Larry Warren arriving into the forest, what was called the staging area, as he was running away from having seen something very strange himself, including a mist on the ground. He ran off with three other colleagues, went to the staging area, which is where all the vehicles had to stop because there was no through road closer to the forest and the farmer's field. And he saw Larry Warren just arriving, which kind of corroborates what Warren had said, that he'd arrived with many others to this staging area point. And there was also an earlier interview from 1984 done by this American researcher called Ray Boucher with someone called Sergeant Adrian Bustinza. Now, it wasn't entirely clear, but it seemed to describe another landing that was much more reminiscent of what Warren had said than what Halt had said about Jim Penniston. So we'll come to that. So the reinvestigation begins, and I am looking to find anybody that can corroborate his account. Well, two people really did corroborate his account. Was one person on the left, which is called Steve Longero, and that person I've just mentioned, Sergeant Adrian Bustinza. The person on the bottom of the right screen is called Steve LaPlume. He was a friend of Warren's, and he remembers after the incident Warren telling him very graphically about his involvement and documenting it in interviews, etc., which stands up very, very close to what Warren had said to other people. So there was this direct testimony, and we'll go into Steve Longero's testimony and also the hearsay testimony of Airman Steve LaPlume. There was also other indications that said that Colonel Halt perhaps knew more about Larry Warren, even though he'd been trying to say he wasn't involved. He interviewed Colonel Halt in 1993, and when he asked for the tape recording to be turned off, Halt admitted that the National Security Agency were interested in Larry Warren, that Halt had attempted to gain access to Warren's military file without success, and Halt confirmed that beams from a UFO had penetrated the nuclear bunkers in Bentwaters, which was an RAF Bentwaters weapons storage area containing tactical nuclear weapons. So again, all of these things off tape, but said, and this was heard by a researcher called Bob Oshler, who sadly passed away a few years ago. But again, we have his testimony, and it's referred to in a book called Left at East Gate. And I actually interviewed him personally in October 2018 over the phone, and he corroborated everything that was in this original book. Well, now, one of the things that's interesting as well, and is involved in the documentary, is that Larry Warren, the original military whistleblower, was asked to take a polygraph test for the documentary. And whilst I won't go into too much detail, he did pass with flying colours a modern polygraph test, which involves 5 different tests hooked up to a computer. And the lady wearing the pink jacket is a lady called Patty Musicaro. She is the leading polygraph examiner in the UK, although she's an American. She's the chairwoman of the Polygraph Examiners Association in the UK. and she said he passed with flying colours. Interestingly, no other military witness involved in Rendlesham Forest has undergone a modern polygraph test, which was accurate to 94.6, I think, percent. So again, further indications that what Warren was saying all along was correct. Now, an important thing that I just want to mention here is that when Ray Boucher, that American researcher who'd done great early research, in one of the things that I came across in the research document that he sent me was that he'd actually done a phone call with Colonel Halt in 1984, 1985. And he basically, 1985, where basically he just rang him up out the blue, Colonel Halt. Now, interestingly, Halt was still working for the Air Force at the time. And he said, I'm Ray Boucher, I'm doing research on Rendlesham Forest, I've spoken to a number of witnesses, and they basically said that there was a second landing in a field, that it was surrounded by security police officers, that it was being filmed, and that the base commander, Colonel Gordon Williams, was present. And amazingly, when he had asked this of Halt, Halt then said, yes, I can verify, I can substantiate all of that for the senator. And he's referring to Senator James Exon, who was the senator at the time for Nebraska. Now, remember what I said, that Ray Boucher and his colleague Scott Colburn lived in Nebraska, and they'd approached Senator James Exon and said, you should be interested in this because it involves American servicemen in the UK in this very weird UFO. So he admitted, and there it was on paper in the research notes, and it was like amazing. It was an amazing admission that as a former police detective, it leapt off the page, because ever since this was done 6 years before Colonel Halt retired, and since he retired and then became this public person seen on lots of documentaries, he totally has denied ever saying that to Ray Boucher. He denies that he was ever involved in this second landing, and that Gordon Williams, the base commander, was there and the entities had been seen. But in 1985, he'd admitted it out the blue to Ray Boucher. An amazing admission. One of the things that emerged through the reinvestigation was the fact that nobody knew that all of the 3 radio channels used by the US Air Force Security Police, all of those were recorded. And we know that because a number of people told us during my research for the documentary that they had replaced the audio tapes on a regular daily basis. And 2, Sergeant Adrian Bustinger had received a package several years after the incident with the 3 different radio channels audio recorded onto what was then cassette tape. So this has never been admitted by Colonel Williams, then base commander, nor has it ever been admitted to by Lieutenant Colonel Halt, who at the time. And he's never admitted this. He should have. Significantly, and I don't have time to go into the details, but in the run-up to the events that took place in late December 1980, there had been 3 significant, what I call precursor cases that are listed in the book. One involving Laurie Rarefault, the lady in blue at the top of the screen, and that occurred in February of 1980. Then there was another incident involving an airman called Michael Stacey Smith. The photograph of in the black uniform. After his time in the Air Force, he became a police officer. Michael Stacey Smith. That had happened in July. And then the guy in the bottom in the combat gear is a guy called Steve Wagner, who told of an amazing incident in November, and who also told us another incident that initially he'd not said, but emerged through the reinvestigation. Now, I mentioned earlier that there was another guy who was able to corroborate Larry Warren's account in part, and his name was Steve Longero. Now, what was interesting about that is that Steve Longero, who's in the photograph, he said that he'd arrived on the base just a couple of days after Larry Warren, and he knew him through basic training. They were on the basic same training at Lackland Air Force Base. Now, he wasn't friends with him, but he knew him because he was on his same intake, i.e. the same group of people all entered the Air Force on that day, and they became like a group of 40 plus people going through their basic training. And there is a photograph where it shows them stood very close to each other. He said they weren't friends because they weren't next to each other in the barracks where they slept. You tend to get to know the people who live near to you, who share bunks with you, that kind of thing. But he said, I knew him. And he said on the night of his involvement, which is incredible himself, he saw Larry Warren arriving at the what was called the staging area where all the vehicles were, lots of people milling about, and he saw Larry Warren there, which corroborates what Em and Steve, Greg Battram had said all along. So again, interesting that he's saying, I saw Larry Warren out in the forest. Greg Battram, yeah, and Air Sergeant Adrian Bastins corroborating it, confirmed. Now, just very quickly, because I know time is running out, I've only got an hour to squeeze this presentation in, but he's important himself because he's the first person witness to seeing a UFO shine a beam down into the row of nuclear weapons storage bunkers. He was inside walking around and he saw that. So he's a great witness that only emerged through the reinvestigation that I did. That's a picture of him now, Steve Longero. He also said that after his incident in the weapons storage area, he was withdrawn from the weapons storage area, taken out into the forest, and he too had a UFO sighting in Rendlesham Forest with 10 to 15 other people. Again, prior to the reinvestigation and me talking to him, none of that was ever known. This is that photograph I was referring to, Lackland Air Force Base. You'll see in the center of the photograph Larry Warren, and you'll see in the bottom left Steve Longero. So very interesting. And now, absolutely great form of recognition. He would have recognized somebody from his course because you did weeks and weeks of training with them. Didn't necessarily know him, might know his name, but he wasn't friends, but he recognized him because he was on the same training course. Now, this is a really important case, and as we draw to a close with only 6 or 7 minutes left of this presentation, we knew historically that something had happened to this lady, Lieutenant Bonnie Tamplin, who was a shift commander at the time, and the story was that something so traumatic had happened that she had to be relieved from duty and basically never went back on shift. Now, we didn't know about really what had happened to her until the reinvestigation, and I spoke to a man called Michael Stacey Smith, who'd had one of these earlier incidents, and he said that basically she'd been on a lonely country road driving from Ariff Woodbridge to Bentwaters, which is approximately 3.5 miles along rural country roads, when a UFO, a red glowing object, maybe the size of a car, had pulled alongside of her vehicle as she's driving, so at car height, and she became terrified. She lost control. She crashed the vehicle into a ditch. The vehicle rolled over. She climbed out of the vehicle, disheveled, frightened, and this UFO was stopped and hovering above her. She then was so frightened she picked up a weapon and began firing at it, discharging several bullets, rounds, at this object, which then disappeared. And that's the story that nobody knew until I did the reinvestigation and spoke to Michael Stacey Smith. Again, all of that was covered up by the US Air Force and I believe the British Royal Air Force and basically the US government and basically the UK Ministry of Defence. After 2 years of trying to find and interview Adrian Bistunja, he finally agreed. And when I interviewed him, he was very reluctant because he'd been very affected by what he'd seen in the field. But he confirmed that Larry Warren's account was absolutely accurate and almost corroborated everything that Larry Warren had originally said back in 1983 when the story broke internationally. And this has great importance because he confirmed that there were cameras there and they were recording. So the question is, what happened to the film? Now, were any of the witnesses subsequently interrogated? The answer is yes. There were a number. One of them is on the screen there, which is a guy called Ed Kabanzak, who was involved on the first night landing. So we know that at least 4 people, Peniston, Kabanzak, Bustinza and Warren, were given very harsh interrogations by a number of agencies, including the Office of Special Investigation, which was the Air Force Police, but also other agencies, including English people who came in to interview them, which nobody will admit to now. Did any of the military witnesses suffer any biological health effect? The answer is yes. Again, Peniston, Burroughs, Bustinza and Warren all suffered some kind of physical illness as a result of being in close proximity to the UFO seen on the first landing and the second landing. And interestingly, another person was Colonel Williams, the base commander. Now, he denied that he'd ever been anywhere near a UFO, and yet in a later test done through of research of victims in close proximity, Colonel Williams was one of those who was interviewed by, I think, former CIA man Kit Green, and Cameron, Grant Cameron, the Canadian researcher, told me this personally in an interview, that Peniston and Burroughs and Colonel Williams had been interviewed as part of that program for illnesses associated with close proximity. So that's pretty amazing. Now, this man is very important to the story. He is the general who was the head of the Air Force in Europe. So the top man in the Air Force arrives at the base within a matter of days. We're not quite sure, but he arrives on the base. He'd been there a month or so earlier just as part of an inspection, but suddenly within days of the incident, this guy turns the head of the 8th Air Force in Europe. No coincidence. So was Colonel Williams involved? Well, close proximity injuries would say yes. The admission that Halt gave in 95 would say yes. Incredible. And there is a photo of Colonel Williams, and it actually said his name as the base commander on the entry point to RAF Woodbridge. This is just a quick photograph of the weapons storage area, and you will see a marking on there that says the hot row. This is where the UFO shone a beam down in like a grid-like pattern. It went all the way along down the hot row as if it was scanning to see what was inside. Now, Nick Pope, I said, again, not time, 2 or 3 minutes left, but Nick Pope plays an important role in this because he became involved in the case very quickly when he went public. But suffice to say that he often told people that he ran the UFO desk. He didn't. He was only 24 years old at the time, and a number of documents, including this one, prove that he did not run the UFO desk at all. He only worked on it for 20% of his working week, which if we equate to a 40-hour week is 1 day a week, 8 hours to this. He was never a trained investigator. He was not a trained researcher. But when he retired, went public with his book and left the UFO desk, he then told everyone that he ran it. And in fact, there are documentaries where he will introduce himself. So I ran the UFO investigation department. Well, he didn't. It's a misnomer. But on the strength of that, he became the go-to guy on the subject around the world. He's been involved at many stages with many of the witnesses and involved in several books by attaching himself to several of the witnesses, and yet never said really that he believed in UFOs or anything. I personally think that he was a plant within the UFO community within America, and he was put there to control the narrative, which he has done for many years until my book was released, all of which is factual data and there is a chapter in the book on Nick Pope. But yeah, a fascinating character and someone who portrayed himself as a real investigator when he was nothing so. Now, terrestrial explanations that are put forward, so many people say that it's the lighthouse. Well, if you remember, Colonel Halt said that a lighthouse, that not a lighthouse, that a UFO had stopped above his feet, that maybe 1,000 feet, and shone a beam down. It was ridiculous. None of the people involved described the lighthouse have any involvement. In fact, that was said at the time. The lighthouse theory is mentioned in virtually every documentary, but the lighthouse theory itself was literally created by the media entirely in the UK, and then became synonymous with the case, and is still synonymous with the case now. So, after 5 years of reinvestigation, 3 years of writing, I concluded how many incidents took place. Was it 3, 6, 9, 12, 15? No, 17 different timed events, the earliest of which were Christmas Eve, which again is a new revelation in the book that nobody knew about, relates to Steve Wagner, who I talked about briefly earlier, but 17 different timed events over what was basically a week-long period, and included at least 3, probably 4 consecutive nights of UFO activity in the forest, but interestingly, also on the bases themselves. It wasn't just in the forest. Now, conclusion. 17 incidents is a lot. The media usually only associate 2 or 3 with this story because they never tell it properly. And I believe in my final conclusions that the British media, the British and the US authorities have been highly complicit in supporting the downplaying of the significance of the Rendlesham case. They literally did not want this story to get out. It emerged kind of accidentally in 1983, and the document that came out said there were 2 incidents. We now know there are many more incidents, but the US authorities will not admit to anything else. And I wrote the book based on this quote from Trey Gowdy, who's a former Republican congressman. This was my mantra for writing the book. I have no friends to reward and no foes to punish. We're going to go wherever the facts take us. Facts are neither Republican nor Democratic. They are the facts. And that was my mantra for writing this book. It's like a forensic re-examination of the case. And every researcher who's read it has said it's basically the definitive book on a case. So it's available on Amazon in any country. Be available through South America on Amazon. It's obviously in English at the moment. Maybe there'll be other translations in due course, but it's only in English. It's only on Amazon at the moment. So without further ado, I want to thank you for your time. I hope that you've enjoyed the presentation. Like I say, it's really a 4-hour presentation crammed into an hour, and I've had to leave a lot of material out. But that gives you a flavour of just the many and wide variety of UFO-related incidents that took place. And there's lots more in the book. So I'd recommend you, if you can speak English, read English, to get the book. But basically, I hope you've enjoyed my presentation. Thank you, SUFOEX, for inviting me to appear at this virtual conference. And that's my presentation.